we're going to be heading into the next bit. I'm going to be up here again, just kind of having a bit of a conversation with Mr. Alex Banks, who is a really cool performer. Hopefully you've heard some of his music. He's a really good producer as well. And he's got this incredible setup with all this wonderful gear. And so we are going to be, or Alex is going to be sort of taking you through his live setup, how he's using Ableton in that live setup, what all of this gear is doing, but also just talking about kind of the conceptual approach of setting up a live show, how to take your songs from the studio to the stage, what bits you want to take, how you can play them back, how you approach deciding what synths you might use, if you want to use that, all those sorts of things. We're going to go into a lot of stuff about live performance, and then later you're actually going to get to see Alex do the whole show, which is going to be pretty cool. So yeah, without further ado, give it up for Alex Banks.
I'll do a little run through of the track first.
Yeah, so I think we're going to start. Alex is going to just do a run through of a track or two, just so you can get an idea of what the performance actually looks like.
Cool. Thank you.
So there is a lot going on there. I think let's just dive right in. Do you want to walk us through what's happening?
Cool. So, yeah, I guess to begin with, I'll just give you a quick overview of the equipment I've got here in front of me. I'm not going to go into detail just yet, but as we go through, I'll talk about why I've got this equipment, what I'm doing with it, and why I chose it and how it's helping me play the set. So to begin with, obviously, got my laptop running Ableton Live, and I'm using Ableton Push controller here. I'm using two Allen & Heath K2 controllers here, which are 2 banks of 4 with lots of knobs and buttons. This is totally mappable, so I'm able to assign these sliders and the knobs and the switches and everything to basically whatever I want them to be. I'm using the Roland TR8S drum machine here. I'm using the Moog Mother analog synth, which is just a single oscillator analog synth. I've got a little modular setup here with some Euro rack stuff in it, which I've specifically chosen just for the live set to manipulate sound with. So there's not actually any tone generators, there's no synths in this part of it. This is all basically so I can mangle the sound that I'm putting through it. Over here I've got the Chord Chaos Pad as the model, the third version of it, which is great also for mangling sounds. Obviously it's got the touch pad on it, so I can just kind of go over to that and do stuff really quickly. Over here I'm using, this is a nano pad controller, real simple lightweight thing, which I'm just using for one-shot samples. Over here I've got the Roland SCO2, another hardware synth. Got the Strymon Big Sky reverb here, got a Roland sort of Space Echo emulator, and I'm using a Motu Ultralight sound card here with lots of inputs and outputs to connect all of this stuff up with. And finally, that's going into the Play Differently Model 1 analog mixer. So there's a lot of stuff here to play with, but it may really seem complicated at the moment. It might seem like I've got all this equipment, but actually once you break down why I've got it and how to use it, it's not actually as complicated as it seems. And the whole idea here about building my live set is to build something which is basically like a playable instrument. That means I can manipulate the sound, be really creative with what I'm doing, but in a very controlled way so that I can actually use it in a live context and I don't get too lost. So first things first, we'll look at how the process sort of evolves. Basically, I finished writing an album about 1.5 years ago that came out last June on a label called Mesh. Album's called Beneath the Surface. And having finished the record, I needed to think of a way that I was going to play it live. When I'm making music in the studio, I've got quite a few analog synths. I'm using a lot of hardware, but I'm also using tons of plugins inside my sequencer. And there's a lot of tracks, a lot of different parts to the tracks, and a lot of complexity. But I'm just one guy, and I might have lots of different synth parts in the track. But I've got to think about how I'm going to be able to translate that to a live set. So to begin with, like from the final mix down, when I get it mastered, I'm actually sending off about 8 stems per track. So I mix all the drums down to one track, I'm mixing all the bass down to another track, and I've spent literally months like tuning these different tracks to kind of get the mix down just right. And at that point, I could then try to import that into my live set. I actually like to go the extra mile, and instead of just getting my tracks mastered, I send them off to a place in Berlin, and they do what's called stem mastering. So they're actually taking these 8 tracks, and they're kind of tweaking them even more, and then send them back to me along with the stereo master, which goes to release. I've actually got these stem mastered individual stems. I've got the drums and the bass, etc., that have been tweaked by these guys in Berlin who are absolutely amazing. And it just gives it that kind of extra dimension of quality. So what I then want to do is go through, I might say look at my drum track, or maybe look at a synth track or something like that. And I want to go through and I want to chop out bits of that I can potentially use in my set. Now, I guess like there's kind of 2 ends of the spectrum you can go with your live set. You can have infinite number of possibilities and try and play everything live. But I've kind of found that if you have too many possibilities and you're trying to play all the different synth parts and you try and do everything at the same time, you end up not really being able to do any of it particularly well because you've only got two hands and you just can't possibly keep on top of anything. On the other end of the spectrum, you could just have the stems, press play, and do almost nothing and just kind of tweak a few filters. But that doesn't really feel like a very live performance. But it would sound great because you've got your kind of, your mix down, really kind of super tweaked audio that you tweaked in the studio. So effectively, I'm trying to get somewhere between the two, and I'm trying to think of ways that I'm going to be able to present the best sound that I possibly can, just like it was in the studio, but also incorporate a large amount of flexibility and fun, basically, because when I perform, I want to be able to tweak stuff, I want to be able to manipulate the sound, I want to feel like I'm delivering a live performance, and so do the audience, but you obviously have to make sure it sounds good. So anyway, from an audio point of view, I might go through, say, the drum tracks. Let's just have a look at some of the drum clips that I've got on here. And rather than taking huge chunks of the drums, I just want to kind of get stuff down into loops so that I can trigger the different sections. So let's just have a loop at the first beat here. Let's get some sound up. So you can hear it's like the basic part of the beat. This is how the track opens. And then I've scanned through, I think I've actually cropped these clips. So if you, just for the sake of imagining it, this was actually like a 5-6 minute long piece of audio originally, and I've decided like, okay, I'm just going to take this little loop here. Next bit. It's a similar beat, but you can hear there's a hi-hat pattern come in and a few other bits and pieces. I've got another one here, I've called it Beat Full. You can hear some other elements in there. Now, as my track goes on, like the actual studio version which has been released, there's quite a lot of variation within the drums. There's a lot more than what you've just heard there, and there's actually some other elements, but there's not really a lot of fun in just, as I say, like playing back the drum audio as it is on the record, because you want to be able to have some fun with it. So I've taken those basic bits of the main parts, but I've also left some flexibility for adding some other bits over the top. So for example, on the record, there's like a kind of 808 tom pattern that comes in over the top at some point. And again, on the record, I kind of manipulated that with some filters, I added some effects. So I thought it might be quite fun to have a similar sounding tom pattern that comes in on the drum machine. So if I just trigger this scene. So you can hear there's a 808 pattern here. I can mess around with this, and because it's on a separate track by itself, I can add some delays, I can add some other effects, some reverb, whatever I like with it, and I can bring it in and out over the top. Also in the track, maybe there's some claps, there's some extra hi-hats or something like that. And even other bits and pieces that aren't on the track, I've basically programmed these onto the drum machine. So if I want to add some extra bits and pieces in, then I can do. So maybe we'll add some claps here. So as you can see, we've got a fairly simple drum pattern, which isn't that complex, but I'm able to add other bits and pieces over the top of it. I've also, well, we'll come on to other effects that I can use in a bit, but let's look at a keyboard part, for example. I use a lot of filtering in my productions. As the track evolves, I like to add effects. I love to use filters to kind of open up the filter and kind of add like build and emotion and kind of add some interest. So you might get some parts of the track where a keyboard part is perhaps opening kind of quite slowly, like a synth part is opening with the filter really slowly, and that's building some emotion, and say it builds over 8 or 16 bars or 32 bars in the studio version. I might not want to be locked to those 32 bars where I'm playing live and I have to kind of, reaches the peak after 32 bars and then I have to switch to the next section. So in a part like that, I might find a section of the synth where the filter is completely open, you're getting a full range of frequencies, and I can add a filter here, and I can build it as much as I want or cut it back as much as I want. But you might get other examples if we listen to this keyboard part here. If I can just bring this up. So you can hear on here, there's quite a lot of filtering. There's like an LFO on it. Now I had to make a decision on that bit. I was like, am I going to take the straight keyboard part? Am I going to add a filtered LFO on that? Or am I just going to take the bit from the studio recording and use the bit that's got the filter on it? So I might look at the part of the track that's going to come in. I'm thinking, well, what else could I be doing at that part of the tune? Is adding a filtered LFO manually the most interesting thing that I can do with that part of the track? And actually, like, I'm already glitching out the drums. I've got another synth part that's coming in there and some other bits and pieces. So here's an example of something like, well, I could be really live and I could add that filter LFO and I could do that myself, but actually there's no point because I know that filter needs to kind of swirl around to do that LFO thing there. So let's just make life a little bit easier and decide to take the bit of audio that's already got that effect on it to free my hands up and free the headspace up in order to manipulate something else. So basically, I hope the concept kind of makes sense, but I'm going through the audio and I'm picking bits that either they're going to work in the background with the effects on, or I'm picking bits out that I'm going to be able to add effects myself. I'll go into more detail in a minute what kind of effects I can add, but these are the basic things that I'm thinking about as I'm working my way through the audio and taking out the parts that I want. So I might also want to look at kind of structure, and I'll be taking out, I say, like looking at clips that I want, and then I've got to think about different sections and different scenes. You guys know about scenes in Ableton and sort of, you know, how the idea of that's working. So you can see over this side, I've got like drop one, I've got bass break, I've got Juno drop, and I'm trying to name them in certain ways that when I'm playing live, if I want to trigger a scene, I want to go to a certain section, then I know that, okay, drop one, that's pretty obvious. That's going to be the first drop in a track. So let's just have a listen to what that sounds like. So obviously everything's coming in there. But in the studio versions of my tracks, there's quite a lot of variation. There's quite a lot of different sections to it. And I could quite easily end up with like 20 different scenes, even more, for all the kind of individual bits. So again, coming back to this concept of working out, you know, what I want to include in my live set versus like keeping it like the studio version versus trying to keep it flexible and trying to keep it live, I won't have a scene for every possible section of a track because I want to keep some of it kind of free and improvised. So I'll only choose the main scenes that I want to use. So like I say, I've got the drop, I've got the breakdown, I've got another drop, but I might want to kind of on the fly do a completely different variation. So if I play this, so maybe I'm going to drop out the bass, I decide to bring in the synth instead. Okay, the bass didn't drop out. And then maybe I want to try a different drum part. And then I mess around with the synth or something like that. But I can mess around with this for ages. Then there might be a point where I'm like, okay, I actually want the drop now, and then I can actually trigger a scene and everything's going to come back in. So it's this balance between being able to like pick and choose the bits that I want, but then having key scenes where I'm like, well, I know it's going to have that drop in it at some point, and fans that have maybe come to a show and they're expecting to hear the tunes in a certain way, whilst lots of variation and playing around is good, there's got to be certain points where you trigger a scene and everything's going to kind of kick in as you want it to, and it's going to sound a little bit like it does on the record. So in terms of the number of scenes that I want to kind of include in a track, where possible, I want to break it down into 8 scenes if I can. It's not always possible, but a maximum of 8. The reason being, and this brings us nicely on to how I'm using the push controller in the setup, is that I've got a matrix here. It's basically like 8 by 8, And where possible, I'm trying to get, can you see that on the screen there? Yeah, you kind of can. Where possible, I'm trying to get all the parts that I might want to use in one track in front of me on the push controller in one go. So that if I want to trigger this synth part or I want to trigger that part, I don't have to cycle through lots of menus. I don't have to sort of fly around the arrangement trying to find some bit on the fly, because when you're on stage and you're in the heat at the moment, there's nothing less creative than like clicking on the things thinking, oh god damn, where's that thing? It's like, no, you just want it in front of you, so at a moment's notice you're like, all right, let's bring in that part, let's bring in this one or whatever. So where possible, I try and get it into 8. And obviously, as you know, in Ableton the scenes are going down the page, but I'm also trying to get the number of parts or the number of individual channels that I want also down into 8. So I've got my groups here. I've got drums, bass, vocals, leads, pads, ARP mother, which is this thing here, Atmos, and other 2. So basically that means that at any given point in any track, I know that my drum parts that I want to trigger, they're always going to be in this drum column here. The bass parts, they're always going to be in the bass column, vocals, leads, etc. So basically the concept that I'm getting here, or getting to here, is being able to condense all of this stuff into a very logical format that you can use in a live context, because I've kind of learned from quite early on, where I had like sprawling arrangements and loads of channels and a lot of complexity, that when you're playing live, you don't actually end up being able to use it because you don't know where anything is at one time. So being able to have this set up, I find really helpful, because it means I can just go to things and I know where they are in front of me. What is also really useful is, I know Thomas was talking about Max for Live earlier. There's a Max for Live plugin called PD2. I think it's about 30 quid or something like that. Basically, it transforms the display on the push controller into like a view that looks a bit like your session view. I don't know if you can, yeah, you can kind of see it on there. So here, all these blocks that you can see, it basically looks a lot like my arrangement, a lot like my session view on Ableton Live. So rather than having to look over here, try and work out what the clips are, go back over to the controller, try and work out what the clips are, I can actually see, and I can see what colors they are. So I can color in the clips. The scheme that I kind of come up with myself is like dark blue means that it's normally kind of a fairly major part of the track. Maybe the lighter colored ones, it might be more of a kind of atmospheric part or an incidentary part or something like that. So again, it comes back to this thing of being able to look at something and trigger it and just access it straight away, which means that you can really improvise with the arrangements. So yeah, that's kind of the basic concept behind that. Going back to the bank of 8s thing, I've also got this lined up with this controller down here, and as I have these columns that I described with the drums and the bass and the vocals, etc., set up on the push controller, almost directly in line, if I go down, you can see that I've got these 8 faders and 8 knobs here, and we've got drums, bass, vocals, leads, whatever. And again, it's standardized, so I know if I trigger a drum part and I want to change the volume, my drum channel is always down there. And I've just lost my slider, but there we go. This has just jumped off. That wasn't part of the plan.
Has that ever happened in a live show?
Once, yes. And at the end of the show, I had to kind of crawl around on the floor. It's like, has anyone seen that little plastic slider thing? So again, it kind of comes to this thing. It's like building your own instrument, really. And I often relate it to, like, if you're driving a car, like, and you drive someone else's car, the gear stick might be in a slightly different place, or the steering wheel feels different, and it takes you a little while to get used to it. But you know, you sort of get to know it. And this is my instrument, so I built it in such a way that I know that if I want to trigger a drum part, it's always going to be in the far left column. If I want to control the volume, it's in the slider directly below it. And it just means that, like, after a bit of practice, whilst it looks complex, maybe having all these coloured bits kind of lit up on the controller, and whilst it looks like it's maybe complicated having all these sliders, once work your own system out, it becomes really intuitive, and it means that the more comfortable you are with the setup, the more creative you can be in your arrangement, and the more confident you feel about experimenting with your arrangement live, and maybe trying different combinations of parts, bringing in this drum part but another synth part to go with it, or whatever else. So yeah, that's the kind of basic concept behind that. Right, moving on to effects and what it is that I'm actually doing with this controller here. So let's look at what these knobs are and the buttons and whatever that they're controlling. So stick with the drum channel for the moment. So kind of the quickest and the easiest way I find of like messing around with the part is looping, and the top knob on here on the fader I've got linked to let's go over here, a plugin called Tornado. It's made by Sugar Bytes. It's quite an old plugin. I've been using it in my live set for years, but it's really quick and easy to use. And you can see that when I turn that knob, that's moving the control, moving one of the parameters on a looper there. Dead simple, really easy to use, but really effective if you want to do a build up or something. You can just kind of very quickly loop that, and that's obviously a software plugin, so that's running within Ableton. But things also get interesting here. If I hit that switch there, that is basically going to send audio out of my sound card. It's going to send it into this granular looper here, which is part of my little modular setup, and it's going to send it back into Ableton Live on another input and back in on the same channel. And that is using what do you actually call it? External audio effect plugin, something like that. So it's the most boring sounding plugin, like external audio effect, but it's so useful for using any hardware, because basically by flicking that switch, or pressing that button, which I've assigned to that plugin, it's doing this little loop, sending the audio out of Ableton Live through this bit of hardware, almost like it were a plugin, and straight back in again. And it means that I can now use that effect on my drums if I want to. So let's just sample, show you what it does. If I hit record there, it's now recording into this sampler. I've got a dry-wet control on this knob here. So if I go like that, it's now fully wet going through this looper. And I can now mash up my drums as much as I want. Completely obliterate it if I want to. Doesn't always sound that good, but and then as soon as I've had enough of mangling it, flick that and it turns it off again. Now, as I go through the set, I might not just want that on the drums. I might decide maybe I want to put some vocals through that effect. Maybe I want to put a lead part or something else through that effect. So I had to think of a way that was really accessible, that I can just basically not just have it on the drums, but be able to put it on any effect I like. So across this whole top row here, basically all of these top switches, all of them do exactly the same thing, but they've all got their own instance of the plugin. So basically I've got pretty much 8 versions of the external audio plugin, all with the same settings, sending it out of the output on my sound card through the granular sampler and back in again. So if I want to use it on my vocals, I know it's always going to be that top switch. If I want to put it on an ARP, it's always going to be the top switch. So there's this standardization, like I've built my own mixer effectively, like cool, I know that that's going to do that, and any point I want to add that effect to something, then I know it's always at top row of buttons, and I don't even have to label it because I've kept it the same for each set, so I know that that's what that's going to do. And similar concept, if I move down to the next row of knobs, it's using this resonator effect, which is called Rings by Mutable Instruments, and it's kind of a fairly similar sound in some ways to the resonator within Ableton. It's got its own flavour to it, but so if I want to add that to my drums, we'll use the same beat. And I can use these knobs to play around with the sound in real time. As you can hear, it's quite an extreme effect, and I might not want it to be sort of that dense. So I've set this up with these knobs for the dry-wet control. So I can just add a bit of it if I want to. But I mean, it's all well and good. I've got this nice Euro rack gear to kind of do that with, and you might be thinking like, well, I can't really afford all of this stuff. But actually, the concepts I'm describing here, you can use it with any of Ableton's plugins. You don't have to have mutable instruments rings. You could set up a controller with exactly the same controls on it and just use the resonator with an Ableton and have some really creative results like that. So if you can see there, I've labeled it rings. This is an external audio effect. Can you see it on the screen? Yeah. So if we just do Command M, and then you can see the dry wet knob is there. And I won't do it now, but if I then just twist the knob that I want to map to that, then that's going to control that. And also to turn it on and off, you can see here that I've mapped the on-off control to these switches. So quite simply, you put it into in mapping mode, which is just Command M on the Mac, click on the thing you want to map, and press the switch, move the controller, and it maps it to it. It's dead easy.
So how did you decide what effects you wanted to use? Did you have like an idea of, I want to kind of do these sorts of things to the sound, or do you just have a bunch of stuff and kind of explore?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Like, I basically put this setup together about a year ago, sort of as it is, pretty much when I'd finished the album. But before that, I was using a live set, which didn't have as much hardware. I wasn't using so many hardware synths, and I wasn't using hardware effects. But I guess I liked the idea of kind of building on what I had before. So instead of just using internal plugins, I was like, right, what else can I get? And as you'll know, Eurorack is becoming really popular. There's all sorts of companies making some really interesting effects. So I thought it'd be quite cool to have some hardware to play with. But I didn't want to get lost in this world of Eurorack where you're just buying endless amounts of modules and not really kind of knowing what to do with them. And also, obviously, you've got to think about logistics when you're touring, particularly if you want to take stuff on a plane, what you can physically take with you as one guy with a couple of cases. So I limited myself to one rack, and I asked quite a few friends who are really into Eurorack, and asked some forums on Facebook. There's some really good resources out there of people who just live and breathe the stuff, that know about every single module and everything that it does, and just kind of asked around really. But just concentrate on things that I thought would be really interesting to mangle the sound with, because I'd already made the album. I already knew what sounds needed to be in the tracks. So I wasn't really that interested in creating new sounds on the fly and kind of totally new tracks. They had to be versions of tracks and music that I'd already written. So yeah, I thought granular looper, a way of kind of stretching and mangling the sounds, would be really cool. This resonator, a friend of mine had got one and I heard it, and I really liked it on drums and thought it really sounded really cool on some other parts. And I also got this Q-Pass filter, which is a fairly new one from Make Noise. As I mentioned earlier, filtering is a really big part of my track with my tracks, with like the arrangement and kind of building emotion and drama. So I just thought, well, I'll get a really nice Eurorack filter that's kind of really juicy and squelchy. So if there's a part that I really want to kind of almost play with the filter, then I've got this hardware unit that I can use. And I'm also using this Erica Synth's Black Hole kind of echo delay kind of thing, which has got this like tape control. I'll just give you a quick demo of that actually. So it's got all the controls on the front. I don't have to go into any menus or anything like that. And it's just really fun having something that I can just kind of play with. But I mean, if you didn't want to buy a Eurorack module, but you still wanted to do some cool tape delay effects like that, you could just use a Ableton plugin or a Max for Live plugin, and you can get your £50 controller and map some of the controls to it, and you can actually still do that live. I like to make life difficult and carry around this great big heavy lump of metal with me, but but you don't have to have all this stuff to be creative. You know, just using Ableton Live and a controller, you can map map your controls to the plugins, and you can still get some really creative results without it. I'll give you a quick demo of the filter as I'm talking about it. So just turn that off. So you can hear that's got a really like squelchy kind of thing going on. And I've also patched that into a LFO that I've got going on over here. So if I want to I probably wouldn't want to use it on that drum part, but you can kind of hear what it's doing. And actually, that's a fairly new thing that I've incorporated. Using the CV tools, I was able to send a clock out, as you can see there. So outside of the kind of 8 channels that I was talking about earlier, I've got like all this kind of utility stuff over here, so I can have like a track with my clock out on it, and it's not getting in the way of what's going on the push. I don't have to trawl through that. It's just kind of happily working in the background, sending clock out of one of the outputs on this sound card, and I'm able to put that into this thing here that's basically kind of means that I can patch it into the filter and create an LFO. Kind of sounds complicated, but it's not really. It's just sending clock output and kind of patching it into something. So yeah, it's really nice when they released CV tools. It's like dead easy to use.
So a question I wanted to ask you is, so we've got a bunch of, you've spoken a bit about the sort of signal flow and how things are routed through different tracks and different effects. You've got, and you also spoke about the stems and how those have all been balanced nicely, but you've got a lot of extra gear, like you've got the drum machine, the synth, you've got the samples in Ableton Live.
Yep.
And I know this is a problem I've had with live performance using outboard gear, is you obviously pack it all away and you get to the gig and the levels are all different.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage when you get set up, making sure that the mix still sounds good with all these additional parts that you've added?
Yeah, so all of the mix basically is sort of done in the studio, and with the hardware I'm making sure that the volume controls, they are all set to a certain level. So I know that the TR8S, the drum machine here, that needs to be on 3/4. The mode mother here needs to be on 50%. The back of this, the volume on that I never touch. So the kind of volumes are usually set at a level like that, but behind the scenes, I'm also able to use this channel here. It's called SCO2, and what's going on here is the audio from this synth here is going into my sound card, and it's going into that channel, and so it's not going straight out into the mixer. It's going through Ableton Live first before it actually gets out of there. And what that means is, as well as volume control, I'm able to automate all kinds of effects and have presets load up at certain points in the track, which are going to control the mix and control the tone of that sound, so that when I get to that part of the track, maybe it needs a certain reverb on it, or it needs a certain distortion, or it needs the volume set to a certain level. And that stuff is going to go on in the background without me having to manually set it for every single kind of part of the track. So I'm doing that using largely using clip automation. So let's just get in here. Okay, so here, I think Thomas was talking about this earlier. In the envelope section, we can see that I've got some information for the chain selector control within this clip. And if I just go back to the other view, you can see what that's basically doing is that when I trigger a scene, sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, hang on. Right, so when I trigger this bass drop, this clip, sorry?
I think it might just be further down. It's got a whole
Oh yeah, there it is. So when I trigger this scene, this clip here is going to trigger called bass pulse, and within that MIDI part, there's some chain selector information, and what that's doing is telling Ableton Live that I want to go to a certain preset that I've set up, and it's loading up a reverb effect, a short reverb effect. It's changing the volume, it's adding a bit of distortion maybe, and oh yeah, here we go. So all of these effects on here, there's a bit of sidechain compression on it as well, which is listening to I think it's linked to the kick drum or the drums, so that it's kind of reacting to it. Because people quite often ask, like, well, if you got your bass coming in live from a synth, then how do you deal with the sidechain? Because sidechaining on the bass and the drums is so important on your mix, particularly when you're playing in a club. If you've got that bottom end energy, then you need to make sure it's balanced. So I can have all this set up, like get the mix as good as I want, and have it automatically select those presets on those plugins when I launch that clip. As I work my way down through the set, there may be another part where I want to use that synth, and let's just go to another one. And on this chain selector here, it will trigger a completely different set of plugins, and you can have as many as you want, because every time it's selecting, every time the chain selector is moving and it's selecting a new bank of plugins, it's turning off all the ones that you're not using. So you could have like 30, 40, 50, as many different plugins as you want, and it's not going to keep on draining your CPU power, because it's only turning them on at the point that you are playing that track. Once you select the next one, it's turning them off again. So, so it's really CPU efficient. And obviously you need to think about that when you're playing live, because you don't want to be stretching your laptop to the max, because it starts to fall over itself and crash. So
that sort of segues quite nicely into what I was about to ask you. Is obviously CPU power is something to be concerned about. You've got quite a bit of kit here. What happens if you rock up at a gig and your Moog decides it doesn't want to work, or you've lost the cable? What sort of methods do you have for when problems occur?
I guess, I mean, I haven't actually set this up, but with the last live setup I had, actually I think I have with some of the bass parts here. Like before I had this SEO2, basically the reason I got the SEO2 is to play sounds similar to my Moog Voyager. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Voyager, but it's a huge synth. It's like that big, it weighs a ton, it's not very convenient for carrying around gigs. So once they brought out, or once I discovered that things like the SEO2 exist, they're much smaller and actually sound quite similar, I ported the sounds from the Moog Voyager and worked out kind of similar sounds here to play with them. But before I had access to this, I basically had sort of buried in another part of the set that I never looked at, MIDI parts for all the bass parts I wanted to play on the Voyager. So if I show up to a gig and I'm going to bring the Voyager with me and I've got the synth, usually local gigs actually, or gigs in the UK, because obviously I could drive with the synth, then I would use those parts. But if I didn't have access to that synth, I would have the audio parts for the bass lines on another track. So it's quite easy, it just takes a couple of minutes to kind of swap the tracks around, and I could either use the MIDI version, kind of like how I've got it now, or if it all went wrong, then I can use the audio version as well. With the setup I've got at the moment, actually all of the arpeggiated parts, or pretty much all of the arpeggiated parts, I'm playing off this Moog Mother, and I don't actually have a backup at the moment, so if that doesn't work, I'm kind of screwed really. But, but I mean, I guess like, the whole idea with the setup is I've got so much stuff to play with that, I mean, yeah, whilst it would be kind of tricky not having the arpeggiated parts, there's so many other elements that I could probably create a whole new arrangement and just do something interesting on the fly and not have to worry about it. But I mean, this is part of the appeal of having the drum machine, is that if, like, I don't know, something's not working properly, or like maybe my laptop crashes, which thankfully happens quite rarely on sets, but like there have been a few times where it's glitched out, I actually really love the idea of having a drum machine that I can just press play on and and it makes noise. So if you've got to reboot your system, or you're going to kind of sort something out, then you can actually still kind of have a bit of performance going that's not entirely reliant on the laptop. So yeah, what other kit? We can look at give you a quick demo of the Chaos Pad as well, while we're sort of talking about effects. I was using this on my previous setup before as well, and I know that John Hopkins and quite a few other guys who perform live use these things, and they're just so good for like glitching stuff out with and kind of adding effects on the fly. So play this drum track again. Yeah. So again, I'm using the external audio effects plugin to route audio through the Chaos Pad and back in again. So I'll press that there, let's loop through it. can add like a grain effect. And the thing I love about it, you just put your finger on it and just wiggle it about, and it makes some really cool sounds. You never quite know what you're going to get, but like that's the fun of playing live, really.
So, I mean, speaking of playing live, you've obviously got this setup that you're familiar with, and it's built kind of like an instrument. So you presumably you can practice it, and you can learn it like an instrument, and kind of be quite fluid with it. And it sounds like you do spend a bunch of time practicing, presumably, to get good with it. How much do you practice, like, this is the set that I'm going to run in this order, and I'm going to trigger these things, and this is kind of how it's going to happen? And how much do you just get on stage and say, let's see what happens, I'm going to improvise?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the gig. The way I've set it up is kind of come back to the concept I was discussing earlier of having like predictability and making it being able to sound like the album if you wanted to, but also having the ability to kind of completely take it off piece and go somewhere completely random with it. And the nice thing about having like all of this stuff set up, or even if you had loads of plugins set up, is that the more ability you have to manipulate the sound, the more you can kind of take it completely off and do something different with it. So I might get to a gig and say the monitoring's really bad, or like, I don't know, there's just not a good feeling, and you're not really feeling like experimenting, and like you just need to kind of play things a bit straighter. Then I've got it set up so that I could just go through the scenes, and as I say, because all the volume levels are already preset, and I've made sure that behind the scenes selecting the different plugins and the volumes are all kind of set up ready to go, I could actually kind of quite easily just work my way through, twiddle around with a few effects, and just play it back sort of, you know, the rehearsed version. But the more comfortable I am with the setup, and maybe you're doing a gig where you're getting a response from the audience that actually they're quite enjoying what you're doing, and they're really enjoying the experimentation, then you can kind of completely take it somewhere different and really mess around with the effects and play with the arrangement. And I might find then I'm using the scenes less and less, because I'm able to see what's in front of me on the push controller. I'm able to bring different parts of the tracks in and out, and there may only be a few points where I'm like, okay, I want to go to breakdown, so it makes sense here because that's going to mute a whole load of parts and bring in some other ones. But there might just only be a few key points where I use the scenes, and the rest of the time I'll just kind of completely go off in a different direction and take it somewhere else. And again, the nice thing about having the drum machine here as a sort of separate thing to Ableton is that I don't have to use the drum parts that are kind of already in the track if I want to. Like again, just give you a quick example. If I wanted to like filter out the bottom end, I could bring in a kick on here. Bring in a drum part. So already you've got a really different feel of a track going on, and I might be like, okay, that's cool, let's bring in the bass line, and then maybe I'll scroll through and I'll find another part of a different track that I want to bring in, like an atmospheric part, and then you start to blend between the scenes. This is something else actually I can touch on. As I was saying about the banks of 8, using the octave button on the push, that jumps it down a whole page, so I'm straight into the next track. I don't have to kind of press loads of buttons, just go down there. So if I keep that rolling, again, using my fader here, I'll kind of pull that down, trigger the part, I'm starting to bring it back in. So I've got the drums from one track still playing, I've got a few beats playing off the TR8, but I'm kind of bringing in a completely different synth part from a different track. So already you're starting to remix things on the fly and take completely different parts of different tracks and kind of build these arrangements. And I could just work my way through the set entirely like that if I wanted to. Or as I say, I could play it safe and I can just use the scenes. Usually it's a combination of the two. Just thinking about scenes as well, just kind of flitting around a little bit, but you can see at the top here, I don't know if you probably can't really see that, but on this top scene here, there's actually no lights on, which means that there's no clips actually programmed into that scene. So you might be thinking, well, why have I got a scene with no clips on it? And what I've called that is called Rev Trig. The track is called Revolution, and trig is basically like it's a trigger scene. And what I've done is removed the stop buttons. There's an example there. Can you see it on the screen? Just flip back. So I've removed the stop buttons for all of the audio and the MIDI parts playing here. But in the background, on tracks that I'm not actually looking at, there's a patch, there's a clip here that's got program change information. So when I trigger that scene, it's going to trigger that clip, and kind of behind the scenes, without me really having to do anything, it's going to load up the sound on the SEO2 for the track Revolutions. It is going to change the patch on the TR8S to load up the sounds for that track. And it's also something I haven't actually talked about yet, but in the background here, I'm using drum racks for the samples, which I'm triggering off of this thing, and it's going to load up the banks of samples that I also want to use for that track. Now, the reason I've removed the stop buttons and kind of put that on its own scene is because, like I just had there, where I had the drums going and like maybe I had a few kind of parts rolling along, if I was to trigger a scene to load up all these patches and all these other kind of utility stuff, it's going to stop the audio that I've already got playing, and I might not want to do that. It is going to change the drum sounds, so I guess like if I was using a certain beat on the CR8, then I've got to accept that that's going to change. But basically, it means that I've got the flexibility to load up all the parts for the next track that I'm going to need, but without completely stopping the flow. So you haven't got to go through and think, oh right, I need to load up the patch here, I need to change the sounds on here. I can just trigger this blank scene, and it's doing it all in the background without me having to think about it. So I can just concentrate on being creative and start to play the next track. Cool.
I think let's give it a round of applause.
Thanks a lot. Cool.